Funding Rural. I'm Erin Borla with the Sisters Oregon-based Roundhouse Foundation. When we talk about pathways to success for young people in rural and Indigenous communities, what does that look like? Well, it can look a lot of different ways, as Dreama Gentry has learned. She's had a long career working with young people, and recently she founded and serves as the CEO for Partners for Rural Impact. Her organization works to empower and uplift young people across several regions of the U.S. Dreama grew up in rural Kentucky, and even though her path took her away from her roots for a little while, those roots shaped her at a very deep level.
And I often say I'm an Appalachian by birth and by choice. It's where I live, it's where my home is, and it's why I do my work. And I think that's the beauty of rural America, is that those of us who came from rural America and who have the opportunity to come back and live in place and do the work. Now, I live about 20 minutes from my family farm, so I'm not on the family land, but it is the place my family has been since the early 1800s. And so this is our home.
Yeah. And you had this pathway to success, right? You left, came back. Talk a little bit about that, and then I want to get into what you're doing with Partners for Rural Impact.
Yeah, so my story is similar to the story of, I think, many folks who are in rural America and are working to improve and to provide opportunities for others. Is I grew up in Appalachian Kentucky. I didn't realize I was growing up in a place of poverty because I was surrounded by family and I was supported. And my parents loved me and they supported me. But it's interesting, they didn't have the goal that I would go to college. Their thought was success would be graduating high school and getting a job and starting a family. When I decided I wanted to go to college, they were right there for me. They didn't understand, though, how to navigate that. And so luckily I had guidance counselors and I had college access programs that I was engaged with in the summers. And so I ended up in college and I went to Berea College, which we could talk forever about Berea College, but it's a unique college in Appalachian Kentucky. You had to be poor to attend and you had to have a lot of academic promise, and you actually attended for free. So there was no tuition. So I graduated from Berea with no debt and was able to go on to law school and practice law for a couple years. And I realized, wait a minute, I'm doing good work. I was working at a plaintiff's firm, but I was still seeing the folks I grew up with not have the same pathways and the same supports. So I came back to Berea College and asked them to let me work with them on creating more pathways to mobility for others. And they brought me on board half-time. I was at a local high school in Rockcastle County, Kentucky, doing college access work. And it was all about lifting educational aspirations for that community and how partnerships between post-secondary and community and school districts could do that. That was in 1995, and continued that work at Berea College and actually worked with some great presidents that allowed me to scale the work. About 2.5 years ago, we took that work and we spun it out into Partners for Rural Impact, because what we realized is what worked in Appalachia could work around the country. And in this time of polarization, it's important that rural places around the country bond together to support and create a country where all rural students can be successful. So Partners for Rural Impact, been doing that since 2022 and excited about now leaning in across the country and doing the work.
That's really exciting. And I love that you sort of came back to where you started and saw the need in where you grew up. And how do we change this? And we hear that so frequently, it takes one passionate leader to be able to make an impact. You use that phrase, upward mobility. Help me understand what that means.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because I think often when folks say upward mobility or economic mobility, they're meaning different things. So when I say upward mobility, it really boils down to a choice-filled life. And the Urban Institute has a great complex definition of upward mobility that includes economic mobility, um, safe neighborhoods, housing, but they also include this idea of an opportunity-filled life. And to me, a choice-filled life is when you have the resources, the supports, and what's necessary for you to actually achieve what you seek to do. So when I say upward mobility, and that's a goal that all young folks should have, that they have the opportunity to make real choices and follow through on real choices.
And seeing possibility, right? I think we talk about that in rural and remote, and I'm sure in other places as well, of like not being able to see what's outside of your fishbowl. And so recognizing that there's an opportunity to see beyond is such an interesting and important component. And for young people, when we're really struggling at those, 14, 18 years old, even older, trying to figure out where do I fit and how, so finding somebody that can lift that piece, I think is really exciting.
And I think it's interesting because young people today have the internet to give them a view of places outside their rural place, but it's not a real view, right? They haven't been there, they haven't experienced it, they haven't seen that real opportunity. I also think that even in small towns, rural communities, young folks haven't really seen all the opportunities that actually could exist for them there because they might be raised. When I was raised, one of the things my mama would always tell me is like, oh, that's not for you, right? That's for the other kids. And I do think that how do we support young folks in exploring their own communities and realizing all of it is for them, but also, like you said, exploring what it would look like in other places too.
So tell me a little. Partners for Rural Impact is just a few years old, but you were inspired by connecting with, was it Harlem Children's Zone? That's really what kind of lit your fire for this place-based work. I mean, in addition to your connection to place, but tell me about that first interaction.
Yeah, and I will say that when I started the work in 1995, it was around college access and success, and it was how do you do really great programs to serve kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so from 95 up until 2010, we were scaling up programs that worked throughout Appalachia. We were doing really great programs, primarily with middle school, high school students. But when I met Jeff Canada in 2010, it was around the Promised Neighborhood Program, which was a federal version of his Harlem Children's Zone program. We were the first rural place to be funded by the federal government to have a promised neighborhood. And the big aha for me there was it's actually possible to start working from birth to 24 and to actually work to create a system of support in a community where every young person has the same supports that I want my children to have. They have chances for great early learning. They enter kindergarten ready to learn. They're at grade level. They have after school programs. They have career exploration. They have tutors, and then they're actually supported moving from secondary into post-secondary. And so Jeff Canada's Harlem Children's Zone model really opened my eyes to you can't program your way out of changing a system or a region or a place. But if you take high quality programs and you take it with and blend it with this, what I call civic infrastructure, this system of support from birth to 24, then you actually can wrap around young folks and move the outcome for every kid, not just the kids enrolled in a program. And that was like a really eye opening piece for us. And so in 2010, we started working in 3 communities and really thinking about what does it look like in a tiny rural place to support families from prenatal all the way up to when their children enter post secondary and are successful. And that's really the big aha for the work and Jeff Canada's model. And, it worked in Harlem, New York, but it works in Owsley County, Kentucky too. And that's pretty cool. It looks totally different, but it's the same foundation, the same framework.
And that's, I think, where the podcast is really focused on philanthropic work, but how do we, philanthropy always talks about scale, right? How do we scale? How do we scale? Well, it works in Harlem, but it's working in Kentucky, in a small rural county in Kentucky. What does that look like for scale?
So I think the first question around scale is what are we scaling? Are we scaling the program or are we scaling a framework and an approach? And I think it's a framework and an approach that can be scaled and adapted locally as easily as a program. When I think about how we took the framework of Harlem Children's Zone, we brought it into Kentucky, but we placed it within public schools. So it changed the cost of it. It changed the focus piece. In Harlem, it's actually its own Harlem Children's Zone, and it has actually the a physical space, and kids go there because they can right after school. But in Kentucky, it's actually part of a public school. It stays open and provides out of school time. So I do think that as philanthropic partners are thinking of scale, they need to think about what are we really trying to scale?
Yeah.
And then also, I would even say question whether it's really scale we should be working toward.
We get lost in this idea, right? And as a funder, where we're sort of not at the table all the time, right? We're funding partners that are doing the work. They're the on the ground direct service organizations. And we can get lost in the idea of, do we want to make strategic impact, or do we want to move a metric? Do we want to impact, 12 people, or do we want to change a system?
Yeah, and I do think that a part of what is seductive about scale is also that some folks want to reach thousands of young people. And then they think about, okay, how can we reach thousands of young folks in a rural place? Because there's not thousands of young folks. So the other push on scale that we're trying to get folks to think about is, if you're really adamant about moving third grade reading outcomes and you want to do it at scale, we actually have systems, and we're creating systems through these partnerships across the country to actually connect in with partnerships that are doing that work in multiple places. So you might be able to reach your 12,000 third graders, but they might be in 10 different states.
Mhm.
And sometimes folks don't think of that as scale either. So I do think, like Jeff Canada, he scaled his work in Harlem and he added blocks and he added blocks, and now they've reached this size that they've stayed. But what he also has done by sharing the model with us, with folks across the country in rural and urban places, is now he's actually scaled it nationally in this loosely held model. So I just think that, what do we mean when we talk about scale? Is it replication? Is it saturation? Um, One powerful piece in a rural community is, while Jeff in Harlem could reach thousands of students with his Harlem Children's Zone, that might still only be a small percentage of all kids in Harlem. But in Owsley County, Kentucky, I have 120 kids per grade level, and I'm reaching 95% of all kids. Still a small number, but actually, we're actually moving that population level number in that small rural place easier than he is in Harlem. And so it's just, how do we factor all of those things in and think about what it is we're wanting to see? What is the result we're wanting to see? I think it is impact, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah. And that saturation model is a really fascinating one. And I don't think we use it enough. I really don't. I think that's a really interesting component. So you and I got connected through Strive Together. And I love the work that they do. They're a national organization. And they use this phrase called collective impact. How does collective impact work with Partners for Rural Impact? Like, help us understand all those components, because sometimes we get lost in the phrasing, and it different, like other phrases, we mean different things to different people.
Yeah, and it's been a really great journey with Strive Together. And I will say that in 2016, when it seemed like folks were suddenly discovering rural, and I was getting all these phone calls. I don't know about you, but people were calling and saying, "Hey, tell me about rural America and how we can do work in rural America." One of the calls was actually from Jennifer Blatz, who's um, the CEO at Strive Together. But what Jennifer did is, she's like, "I really want to learn about what you're doing in rural America and how we can actually partner with you to make sure that Strive Together is engaging and responsive to rural places." And so that really was the beginning of a strong partnership between Partners for Rural Impact and Strive Together, because she recognized that they have a network. The network was not including many rural places, and that the network would be richer if it included rural places. So we joined ourselves with our Appalachian work, and then we over the last several years we've actually been helping them bring new rural places into their network. So when we think about the Strive Together collective impact model, the word that I'm using nowadays to talk about the work is place-based partnerships. Um, and a place-based partnership is where you have at the local level, and the local level could be at the town level, the county level, or even a multi-county level in rural. But you have somebody waking up every day thinking about what collective impact looks like in that community, and how if you align everybody around the table, you think of the resources and you have all the sectors around the table, how do you actually move outcomes for kids from birth to 24? What's the big, bold, community driven vision that somebody wakes up every morning thinking about? And how do they think about what's the data? What are we working toward? When do we know we're successful? And so to me, that's the Strive Together model. It is having that place-based partnership that has a leader, the cross-sector folks sit there at the table, they think about it, and they're thinking about, let's think about our third graders. How do we make sure they're reading at grade level? What's the barriers? Oh, we have food insecurity. You can't learn to read if you're hungry. Well, what about the unhoused population? How do we deal with that? What about safety and security? And there's tables where that happens. And then there's strategies coming out of that that the resources are pushed behind. And it's interesting because when I dug into the model after talking with Jennifer back in 2016, I realized this is what happens in rural places, sort of organically and informally, because rural folks, sometimes the superintendent also might be a pastor, and maybe their brother is actually the person who is actually working at the hospital, right? So you already have these folks that are already circling around young folks, but by formalizing it and using data and setting specific targets, I think we can actually move the dial on most kids in rural America. So that's that place-based partnership model that we, along with Strive Together, purpose-built communities, which does that work in urban areas around community and economic development, and the William Julius Wilson Institute, which is part of Harlem Children's Zone. The four organizations have made a commitment to each other that together, if we're all focusing on this cradle to career approach in our own communities, we actually can move the dial on upward mobility across the nation and ensure that in this country, we really are a place where demographics are not destiny, that we really do have choice.
Yeah. It's like social determinants of health, what you're talking about,
Exactly.
right? For folks that are in healthcare and what happens in philanthropy, and it happens in other institutions as well. But we get really siloed into the like, oh, I'm only focused on this one thing. And this is, so to be able to have my favorite phrase that I heard a while ago was, well, I don't have the right people at the table. It's because you need to build a bigger table. And I think that's a really important piece. And you're right. I think rural does it really well, where they know who's making those moves and who needs to be at the table, who's missing from the table. But the next step is that capacity to say, we know what our priorities are in order to help move this issue forward or support students in this way. Now what? Now how do we build that capacity? And I know you recently were connected with the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But I wanted to touch on, there was a quote in there that struck me from one of your staffers, Eamon Couch, and referencing a county that he's working with where 70% of the students receive public assistance. And part of the issues are around transportation access, healthcare. And that's something that his quote exactly is, you can't learn English or math or anything else when your teeth are throbbing. And it struck me because that's the same thing our organization has said for years around, we were started as an arts and culture funder, and we have said frequently, it's hard to be creative when your teeth hurt and you don't have access to healthy food or clean water. All of those things impact what we're trying to do to be successful. So I wanted to highlight that because I was like, oh my gosh, these are all these intersections come together. But talk a little bit about maybe a success story that you've seen around some sort of building that table.
Yeah, and I think I'll go to Leslie County, Kentucky, which is the county that Eamon was talking about. We started partnering with leadership and community members in Leslie County, Kentucky, in around 2011, and we're still working there. We're still supporting their leadership table. We've also brought in community schools and other programs into the community. And one of the things we realized in Leslie County is there's a lack of capacity of people power. And especially if you think about young folks being supported in the schools are on a shoestring budget. When we started working in 2010, they were in state takeover, and they were really struggling. But what they had was local leaders who wanted to bring in partners to support that. So, one of the things we realized early on is there were residents there in Leslie County that really were looking for their next opportunity. And some of them had some college um, credits. So we designed, working with the community, a partner core program, an AmeriCorps program, where if you had 2 years of college and you wanted to serve in the local high school, then we would put you in there. You become a partner core member, you would tutor, you would be working with the families, and you would be motivating the young folks. And so we placed 20 partner core members in the high school, and they were all ages of folks. They all had some college. And what we realized is it was just magical, because having that additional folks in the school ensured the teachers could really focus on instruction. There was somebody else actually then following up with tutoring and mentoring and connecting with the families. But we also realized that as we pulled that cross sector table together to think about the food security, the health, and the others, is that the partner core members were letting us know what the issues were in the school and what things needed to be addressed. So suddenly we were starting to hear these pieces. So one piece came up was the dental care issue. And so through a partnership with somebody at the table, one of the universities um, that was a couple of hours away came in, and they had dental students that started to come down and do dental care. And we realized at one point they came in, and like 50% of the young folks were needing the dental work, the dental care. So that's a health piece. And folks were like, wait a minute, that's health work. Why are you focusing on it? And it's because it came up from that leadership table. The same way that the partner core came up, that we need additional bodies around the table. One of the cool things they're doing now is they're doing the community school model, which I really think works well in rural. And they started really focusing on home visiting and early child care piece, because how do we actually make sure that when kids are coming into first grade, they're supported and their parents are engaged. And so it's been really interesting to even watch in one community, if you have that infrastructure and that table and you have somebody there thinking and listening to all of those voices, you can then figure out the partners to solve the problems. One of the things we're most excited about, we've started a collaborative called the Rural to Rural Collaborative that has representatives on it from the Delta, from Appalachia, from California, from New Hampshire, and multiple states. And what they all have in common is at the local level, they're all leading these place based partnerships, and they're all working toward these same results. And together, the voice is greater. There needs to be more of a focus at the federal level of investing in rural places and rural kids and rural families. And part of, I think, what I get when I do those visits to DC is, well, what works in rural? And so part of what we have to do is we have to say these things work. Community schools work in rural America. This collective impact model works in rural America. Home visiting works in rural America. And we all need to be speaking from the same place. I do think there are powers that be that try to get me in Appalachia think I have to compete with my friend Karen in the Delta, and that we have to compete over one slice of rural money. And we have to push back from that. So the policy piece and developing this coordinated federal agenda that actually is supporting what works for kids is something we're really passionate about. And I will say that what works for rural kids works for urban kids too. And so we're really excited to be working alongside the Strive Togethers, WJW, Purpose Built Communities, to actually say, how do we create a nation where all kids are supported, no matter where they live? And then how do we, so it's not rural versus urban either. Mm-hmm. So I do think the policy piece is a big piece of sharing what works and then making sure at the federal level that's being heard. I do think at the same time on the philanthropic side is, the numbers on, there's not much private philanthropic money coming into rural places, right? I'm sure you had Win Rosser on, and Win probably talked about the number. I can't remember the percentage, but
7%.
7%, right? How do we change that?
Yeah.
And I do think that part of what we're excited about at Partners for Rural Impact is we do think, because we now have a network of rural places across the country, we actually convene rural folks together on a regular basis. We're developing these relationships with place-based partnerships who have local infrastructure. We can be a pass-through entity. And so it's exciting. We got our first investment from the BlackRock Foundation, and that investment is to actually support the infrastructure for this flow-through process, and then to give us some dollars to actually practice with. So if corporate America or if a philanthropic funder wants to invest in chronic absenteeism in rural America, they can fund us, and we'll have the mechanism to reach communities across the country. And so I do think it's making things easier for philanthropy is part of what we can do. So the creating the opportunity for the flow through dollars, convening rural places and sharing what works, and driving toward that shared policy agenda are three pieces that we're excited about leaning into in the next couple of years. And then I do think an exciting piece for me around the relationship with philanthropy is that it is solutions focused. It's not deficit focused. It's really around a belief that I'm just inspired to see folks hold, that, hey, if we actually listen to local communities, they know what needs to happen to move kindergarten readiness or third grade reading or post-secondary attainment. If we can listen to them and help provide the infrastructure, then solutions will happen. And I think that's something that's interesting about this whole approach is it really is local control, right? It's local voice and local control, and mix that with evidence and best practice. And I think that's how you get these solutions and you get the impact.
I'm so pleased to have gotten to know you and get to know what Partners for Rural Impact is doing. It's such a gift. So thank you for spending time.
And I do appreciate you and your leadership, and you're also continuing to center the places. And that's the hard part, right? It's hard to do this work at scale and continue to center kids and families. And so it's great to be on the journey with you.
Over the past few seasons of this podcast, we've heard from a few national organizations that are doing work at a rural level, at a regional level. And one thing that keeps coming up is the local empowerment. How do we involve local communities? Dreama talks about using that model that was Harlem Children's Zone in rural Appalachia. How do we take that model and scale it slightly differently? So we're not tied to the exact thing that has to be scaled exactly like the first way that it was started, but it's modified and led by community, led by the folks on the ground that know what their community needs and how it can be adapted and how things can work in their area. And listening to those folks on the ground through a convening, through a building a bigger table, right? Those are all the opportunities that we can have if we go to community and hear what their real needs are first. I want to make sure to shout out for the Partners for Rural Impact Summit they do every year. It's coming up here in April. I do hope people take a moment and check it out, especially those funders that are really interested in youth education, education outcomes, all those different things. They really do a great job. As always, be sure to check out fundingrural.com for show notes and other information.